They can be seen only, or they can be seen as candidates, but how a candidate could effectively win the label of middle regional power, so on. And I think an important part of the answer is on what happens inside the country, what are the projects of the ruling elite at the moment, and that is related to domestic politics. And that's one of the aspects that I would like to stress here, because precisely the case of Mexico now is interesting, because there is a new government in place from 9 months of that announces itself as an agent of great transformations. And the question is, what does it mean in terms of foreign policy? In particular, because of the emphasis those new rulers, the rhetoric of these new rulers put in saying that they are putting an end to a long neoliberal era. And that makes me ask how this pretended non-neoliberal approach impacts the domain of foreign policy, and how it is affecting the regional stand of Mexico in Latin America in particular, which is my part. And to answer this question, I will first design a very general picture of Mexican foreign policy to Latin America during the so-called neoliberal era, and then by reviewing the current policies for Central America and the Venezuelan crisis, I'm going to identify the elements that I see could suggest a new approach for the region, and also some of their challenges and limitations. So the neoliberal era. We should just recognize that Mexican foreign policy has maintained a consistent profile from at least the last 3 decades. And it is fundamentally due to what happens, or to what happened, to what has happened at the domestic level, where neoliberal coalitions has successfully maintained control of the government and most of the legislative branch since at least the 80s. Even if sometimes it was achieved through highly contested and controversial electoral operations, such as in 1988 and 2006. But the fact is that they were able to maintain the control of the executive and the legislative branch. Probably those coalitions could be different, could be slightly different for each term, but they were consistent in applying market-centered policies that produced a particular profile in foreign policy too, mainly characterized by showing convergence with the global agenda of liberalization in trade, finance and investment, building strong economic ties with the global north, adopting a rhetoric of liberal democracy promotion, mainly since the beginning of the 21st century, and avoiding international coalitions that could be seen as unfriendly with developed countries. In a recent article, for example, that you wrote about the graduation dilemma, about you three, Carlos, Maria Regina, and Leticia, you propose the case of Mexico as a good example of what you call a dependent foreign policy, because of its orientation toward the geopolitical north and the predominance of regional strategies based on free trade. And in fact, if we make a retrospective of the last 30 years, we would be able to find a lot of significant moments in which those features of a dependent foreign policy are verified in the Mexican foreign policy toward Latin America specifically. On the development dimension, for example, we observe across all these 3 decades a sustained effort to negotiate free trade agreements with Latin American partners, including Brazil. By the way, it failed, but they tried. The Pacific Alliance, for example, which is one of the recent regional enterprises embraced by Mexico, is centered on capital mobility and was built upon an already existing network of free trade agreements among the others, or with the others three members, Peru, Colombia, and Chile. On the security dimension, Mexico participated intensively in the war on drugs and in efforts to contain immigration, as Anna clearly explained, which are two central issues of interest in the regional agenda of the United States. In the multilateral dimension, thus Mexican administration tried to show their engagement in relevant issues of the multilateral agenda by hosting a lot of international meetings. Mexico was a champion in hosting multilateral meetings. We saw in these periods the forum, the meetings like the Asia-Pacific Cooperation Forum, the WTO Ministerial Conference, a convention on climate change, COP16 in 2011, the financial G20 also, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation was also met in Mexico, the second conference on humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, conference on the Treaty on Arms Trafficking, and so on. We have seen a lot of multilateral meetings, but that probably didn't help too much to project Mexico as a differentiated regional voice supported by enduring alliances. The Peña Nieto administration put it clearly, as was already mentioned by Anna, by saying that the general purpose of many of his foreign policy initiatives was to reinforce an image of Mexico as an actor with global responsibility. A profile, a global responsibility that seems to be more much in line with the behavior of a follower of traditional leaders in the global order than with the behavior of an independent actor with his own interests and visions in the world. In a global and regional context where the legitimacy of those traditional leaderships were contested, mainly during the first part of what we've seen in this century, the set of partners with which Mexico could foster such a profile in the Latin American region narrowed considerably in the first decade and a half of the 21st century. Now, the regional context changed considerably, and as well as the domestic landscape in Mexico. As we know, in the 2018 presidential election, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a leftist candidate, clearly defeated two other candidates that were legitimate representatives of continuity in domestic and foreign neoliberal politics. But is this changing the profile of Mexican foreign policy to the Latin American region in a significant way? Before providing some elements to answer to this question, we should recognize a handful of relevant moves during the neoliberal times that didn't match perfectly with the narrative of Mexico as a regional outsider, exclusively focused on its bilateral relations with the United States and completely disassociated from Latin America. This narrative is probably accurate, mostly accurate, as a general assessment for the period. But in order to discuss what kind of legacy the current president is dealing with, it is important to redirect our attention to recent initiatives and decisions by which the neoliberal administrations tried to cultivate commitments with Latin American partners. And first of all, I will briefly comment on the Community of the Latin American and Caribbean States that was created in 2010 during the Felipe Calderón administration, and that represented the possibility of a return of Mexico to the regional scene after a decade in which the main axis of the political dialogue was concentrated around South American borders. It was a decade in which Mexico felt itself as a regional outsider, effectively. That was, of course, in part the result of the Brazilian regional strategy at the time, and a source of disagreements between the two regional giants, if we can say that. And precisely for this reason, it was significant that the new entity was supported not only by both Mexico and Brazil, but also by the Bolivarian government of Venezuela that was very active in those years in the regional landscape. Okay, it is a truth that until now, CELAC, the Community of the Latin American and Caribbean State, have not become the regional forum through which Mexico could reinvigorate its credentials as a prominent regional player. And this is probably in part due to the very regional complexities, but also because of the lack of real interest from the Mexican foreign policy makers themselves. But in any case, CELAC is still there and is a possible platform for the building of a more substantive presence of Mexico in Latin America. The other domain where I would like to draw some comments is Central America. This is another scenario in which we observe a rich set of announced initiatives and projects for Latin American and Mexican foreign policy. Mexico, as we know, played an important role in mediation and peace-building efforts during the 80s and the 90s. And since the mid-90s, the Mexican neoliberal governments articulated the establishment of cooperation mechanisms with its more immediate neighbors. The Tuxtla mechanism, for example, that is rarely mentioned, but this mechanism was named after the city capital of the Mexican state of Chiapas, in which a first presidential meeting took place in 1991 near the Mexican-Guatemalan border. And this mechanism has been maintained as a permanent umbrella under which all kinds of development initiatives have been proposed by the Mexican government. It happened in 1991, almost 10 years before the famous Brazilian meeting in which Fernando Henrique Cardoso proposed his initiative for infrastructure in South America. The Puebla-Panama Plan, proposed by President Vicente Fox in 2000, after transformed into the Mesoamerica Project by President Calderon in 2008, were both initiatives aimed at regional development with chapters on infrastructure, investment, trade, social assistance, and so on. And both were included as part of the Tuxtla mechanism. But again, no significant achievements have been presented until now. It seems like the neoliberal governments didn't want to pay the real cost of engaging seriously with their most intimate Latin American neighbors, and with a handful of exceptions, most of those projects were not implemented. Nevertheless, despite this apparent lack of resources and priority devoted to the Central American policies, for moments, at least, the neoliberal governments tried to show a little interest in developing cooperation networks, not necessarily or exclusively based in a north-south axis. So, we are in 2019 and we have a new president, apparently or rhetorically anti-neoliberal. We have to recognize that even if anti-neoliberal, this foreign policy is not among the top priorities in the agenda of the new president political project. Since his first attempt to the presidency in 2006, it was difficult to discern an articulated plan for the role of Mexico in the international politics in general and to the Latin American region in particular. When asked about his foreign policy plans, López Obrador constantly answered that he considered that the best thing to do for a good foreign policy was to focus primarily in national politics. That's the scenario of self-isolation that Monica suggested. It seems that he would like this. In looking for more elaborated foreign policy concepts during AMLO's 3 presidential campaigns, I constantly remembered the name of Jaime Serra Puche, the former Secretary of Commerce and Industrial Development in the 90s during the Carlos Salinas administration. When he was asked about the industrial policy the government was intended to follow, his answer, as a partisan of laissez-faire economics, was The best industrial policy is not having any industrial policy. So López Obrador seems to have the same kind of aversion to foreign affairs, and he could perfectly answer in a Serrapuche style that the best foreign policy is not having a foreign policy. But leaving those preferences at the individual level apart, the fact is that once in the government, the external political environment has left to the López Obrador administration without the option of not having a foreign policy. And he started to take concrete decision, he and his foreign minister, in particular issues. And during his first 9 months in office, there are issues directly related to the role of Mexico in Latin America that I would like to mention 2 of them in order to know if there are relevant elements that could indicate a change. Those issues are the Central American Plan for Development, that is strongly related to the bilateral relation with the United States, of course. That's the reason because Ana has spoke a little bit about that, and the mediation efforts in the Venezuelan crisis. The massive migration from Central America to the United States is today among of the numerous humanitarian crises in the world. This issue has been present, of course, for decades, and previous governments have also tried to deal with that problem. But in 2018, the phenomenon took new dimensions with the presence of huge caravans of migrants that decided to walk across the Mexican territory to reach the US border and claim for asylum. And even before his inauguration, López Obrador articulated with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLAC, and 3 Central American governments a renewal of their commitment for a common strategy for development. That's the origin of the comprehensive development plan presented officially in December, along with the governments of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and with the auspices of ECLAC. That is the most relevant initiative for Central America for Mexican government in a decade, probably from the Mesoamerican project of Felipe Calderón administration. The plan contemplates 4 pillars: economic development, social welfare, environmental sustainability, human security. And the Mexican government announced that he will invest $30 billion for the next 5 years, and they are also trying to attract donations from other governments, international organizations, and cooperation agencies. The plan is being announced as a new paradigm of migration, development, and cooperation between Northern Central America and Mexico. In the words of Mexican Foreign Minister, the idea is to reject the narrative that the best way to deal with migration is by excluding and controlling. And in fact, previous governments invested a lot in fortifying frontiers, borders, and persecuting migrants inside Mexico. And that with a very bad record in human rights abuses. Changing that paradigm certainly would do a lot for the purpose of building Central American Development Network based on inclusion and on prosperity, having Mexico as a central regional partner. But in the last 3 decades, other Mexican governments have expressed a lot of good wishes of this kind. Will this time be different? Is it compatible with Trump pressures on enforcing traditional migrant policies? That is an open question, in my opinion. Now, the Venezuelan crisis. The Montevideo mechanism is a mediation effort proposed by the governments of Mexico and Uruguay in last February, to de-escalate tensions in the Venezuelan crisis and open a path toward a Pacific solution. For Mexico, that move represented a rejection of the strategy followed by the Lima Group, in which Mexico took part since the Peña Nieto administration, and the Lima Group that have become increasingly attuned to Washington policies in its hardliner positions. But that proposal also sent unexpected signals of the new government's disposition to play an active role in regional efforts to mediate in major regional crises. I said unexpected because the idea of the principle of non-intervention embraced by López Obrador seemed to be, during the first 2 months after his inauguration, a concept that was used to justify a complete retreat from the regional political arena. But no, we said that this proposal of the Montevideo mechanism came after a joint statement with Uruguay on January 23rd and an international conference held in Montevideo on February 7th with the presence of representatives from the European Union and other Latin American countries. Until now, the Montevideo mechanism hasn't really been accepted by all the Venezuelan contenders as a relevant mediation tool for their crisis. But it came in a moment in which other governments in the region were actively taking sides in favor of the opposition more drastic solutions, which apparently included asking a military intervention sponsored by the United States. In the 80s and 90s, the Mexican diplomacy took an important role in mediation efforts to build peaceful solutions to political crises in Central America, for example. Even if sometimes it put Mexico at odds with Washington's preferred policies. This kind of regional approach was less frequent in neoliberal times. Of course, we cannot forget that the Mexican government during the Vicente Fox administration refused to support the resolution in the UN Security Council authorizing military action against Iraq in 2003. But that attitude was, in fact, more an exception than the norm. In face of the so frequent hostilities and provocation, and Mexico in particular, it will be interesting to see if a more independent regional approach is re-emerging for the Mexican foreign policy. Once again, it's an open question. So I presented here 2 current regional issues in which the Mexican foreign policy seems to be offering signals of a new kind of engagement with Latin America, but some challenges and limitations can be observed as well. First of all, the inherent presidential apathy to foreign policy. That's a remarkable feature of the current government. As I explained before, and Anna mentioned too, López Obrador doesn't seem to recognize international politics as an important and unavoidable political arena for Mexico. And we have to wait and see if the Central America Comprehensive Plan and the Montevideo mechanism are pieces of a real new regional engagement or no more than urgent responses for short-term contingencies. In the Central American case, for example, it is worth noting that this new development plan proposed with ECLAC considers only 3 northern Central American countries, from which most of the immigrants afflux come. But for the moment, there are no comprehensive regional strategy. No explicit mentions we find to the existing regional platforms intended to link Mexico to his Central American neighbors, as the aforementioned Tuxtla mechanism, or even the Central American integration system, in which Mexico became a member in 2004. A few weeks ago, for example, in August, in the city of San Pedro Sula, Honduras, was held the 70th meeting of the Tuxtla mechanism. And nor the Mexican president, neither the foreign minister were there. Again, this can be another signal of a very limited interest to densify the Mexican ties to the region. And finally, regarding the Venezuelan case, it has been remarkable the absence of CELAC as another possible forum in which that crisis could be treated. And this absence is still more astonishing from a Mexican perspective, because it was precisely Mexico, one of the more enthusiastic creators of an entity that would give back for Mexico a place in the regional political game. But, well, the current Mexican Foreign Minister, Marcelo Ebrard, confirmed recently that in the coming years, Mexico will assume the pro tempore presidency of CELAC. So we will have there another opportunity to verify the reach of the new Latin American approach. Thank you very much.